When I was 8 years old, I began writing stories. I started with stories about people that I knew that grew increasingly imaginative until I began making up my own characters and writing about their adventures, and eventually I put those stories in the form of books. It became a pastime that I love to this day, all because I had one teacher, Mrs. Yoder, who took the time to kneel by my desk and say to me, "You are a good writer." Those words, which took her all of 2 seconds to say, changed my life. They were foundational in building a world in which I could grow in both self-esteem and skill. So my question for educators is, what kind of worlds are you building with your words? I want to talk about the language of a classroom and the impact it can have on students' lives. In their article, Using Children's Literature for Dynamic Learning Frames and Growth Mindsets, authors Grace Enriquez, Summer R. Clark, and Jessica Delicalce share stories of read-aloud experiences in a kindergarten class in which the teacher was deliberate about the books she chose and the types of conversations that they led to. They used books such as Waiting is Not Easy by Mo Willems, When Sophie Gets Angry, Really, Really Angry by Molly Bang, and Ish by Peter Reynolds to create significant learning opportunities in language. Through conversation, they explored characters' emotions, connected with student emotions, and validated student experiences, and taught students the principles of a dynamic learning framework. The idea of a dynamic learning framework takes the concepts of a growth mindset and expands it beyond an academic setting to encompass a person's whole life. The language we use, the authors say, can promote the ways students view themselves, either as good or bad, smart or not smart, or with the understanding that people are always changing, learning, and growing, and that mistakes are learning opportunities. The authors challenge teachers to think about what kind of future they want their language to promote, and how they can use children's literature to help build it. Their research was limited to a kindergarten classroom, so the teachers of higher grades would need to adapt the lessons to meet the needs of their students, but the principles remain the same. Teachers have the power through the use of children's literature to create worlds with their words. Researchers Julie Dwyer and Alan G. Harbaugh wanted to know how language was being developed through the use of vocabulary instruction in preschools. So they did a study and wrote the article, Where and When is Support for Vocabulary Development Occurring in Preschool Classrooms? In this article, they talk about the importance of language development in young children. One quote says, "Language is one of the most critical capacities developing in young children during the preschool years. Indeed, early language competence is closely related to successful reading comprehension and achievement in the elementary grades and beyond. When children begin coming to school, they come at varying levels of language development based on what they have been exposed to during the first few years of their lives. Some children have had a lot of language exposure, while others have had less. Because of this gap, it's the job of teachers to do what they can to fill in what's lacking in language development." Dwyer and Harbaugh say one significant way to do this is through intentional vocabulary instruction. The article shares data they collected on vocabulary instruction in preschools, showing that overall, little time is actually spent on this valuable area. The authors felt that a lot of opportunities for vocabulary instruction throughout the day, such as during playtime and transitions, was being wasted. While their study was limited to 8 schools in one city and only focused on the vocabulary instruction of preschools, it makes a very important point. Vocabulary instruction at one of the most valuable times for language development is often sadly neglected. So, what are we doing as educators to improve language development in our students? The first thing we can do is look for opportunities to expand students' vocabulary all day long. This is my nephew, George. He is 19 months old, and right at that age when you see language development really happening. The adults in his life are constantly talking to him, reading to him, singing to him, and his vocabulary is expanding every day. And even when he's not speaking, he's responding to the language of the people around him. Put your laundry in the hamper. Who would you like to read the book to you? Which animal is the zebra? And it's fascinating. Every time I'm around him, I can see that his world has expanded a little bit more and a little bit more because he's constantly learning the meaning of new words. But not every kid is as lucky as George when it comes to language opportunities. And that's why it's so important that we as educators step in and fill in the gap as much as we can. Talking to them, reading to them, singing to them. We should be teaching vocabulary explicitly during our lessons, especially during reading lessons. We can use read aloud text to expose students to new words. Exposure meaning more than just defining the new words, but giving them opportunities to interact with new words, use them in sentences, and to hear them often. We should also be on the lookout for chances to teach new vocabulary during other parts of the day, times when children are exploring or invite us into their play, times when students are transitioning from one activity to another. We can use poems and songs to expand vocabulary. Dwyer and Harbaugh suggest writing target words on a sticky note to carry around throughout the day. In their article, they tell us the majority of young children are able to acquire complex language skills if they are exposed to and participate in responsive, rich language environments. The second thing we can do is connected to the first. Use children's literature to create deep conversations. That rich language environment includes the conversations we have around the literature that we're exposing them to. What books can we select that lead to deep conversations? One example that I like to use is Tar Beach by Faith Ringgold. The text opens multiple doors of opportunities for great conversations, even with young children. It represents the experience of someone who lived in Harlem in the 1930s and who dreams of flying over the George Washington Bridge that her father helped to build. What would life have been like for a young girl during that time? What new vocabulary words can students learn from this story? Why would the author refer to the rooftop as a beach? And can a young girl raised in Harlem grow up to be successful? Absolutely. Faith Ringgold did, and she is now a famous artist and author. This leads to conversations around having that dynamic learning framework. Each read aloud experience gives us the opportunity to promote critical thinking and comprehension. And when we intentionally select texts and purposefully guide conversation, we are building students' worlds with our words. Thirdly, as educators, we need to be intentional about our remarks. There's a quote by an unknown author that goes, "Children seldom misquote you. They usually repeat word for word what you shouldn't have said." Children are sponges, and they soak in every word we say. There's a story told by Peter H. Johnson in his book, Opening Minds, about a first grade teacher who said to her students, "I just made a big mistake as a reader. I got distracted when someone came into the room, so I'm going to reread this section here." A couple of days later, a student who was reading independently said, "I need to reread because I just got distracted." Not only did her remark show that it's okay and not a big deal to make a mistake, but it also indirectly taught students what to do if they get distracted. The way that we respond to students and give them feedback is extremely important. Are we telling some students, "You're so smart," and promoting a fixed mindset? Or are we telling them, "You worked hard on that"? Process-oriented feedback is the goal, rather than person-oriented feedback. Even our corrective words are important. In their article, Enriquez, Clark, and Delicalce point out one teacher's remark to a student who said something distracting. The teacher said, "I wonder if that was helpful." Her words didn't label him as a bad student or a failure, but they encouraged him to think differently about his responses. We have the opportunity as influencers in these children's lives to use our words to give them an identity. We tell them who they are, just as Mrs. Yoder did for me when she told me, "You are a good writer." What affirmations are we choosing that build identities within a dynamic learning framework? Finally, as educators, we need to give students the classroom language. Just like in the example from Johnston's book about the teacher whose student mimicked her need to reread because he got distracted, Children will use the language that we give them. We have that power. If we use sarcastic language, they will use sarcastic language. If we use the language of a fixed mindset, so will they. But if we intentionally teach them the language of a learner, we will have classrooms of children who speak like learners. We have to model our thought processes. In a read aloud, for example, model how to think and talk like a reader. Also, if we're listening to them and realize that they don't have the right words to express their thoughts completely, we can supply those words. We have to teach them how to correctly handle conflict and other types of social interactions. Being polite, being an active listener. We need to teach them how to talk about themselves and their learning. In the article, Culturally Responsive Teaching puts rigor at the center. Zaretta Hammond talks about the importance of giving students new language for talking about their learning and how to improve it. We can change their narratives, teach them to say, I can do hard things. It's time for teachers, administrators, and families too, to be intentional about the things that we say and to select meaningful words that expand vocabulary, deepen conversations, and critical thinking processes. Build a dynamic learning framework and teach students how to talk. What kind of a world will your words create?